Merkabah Mysticism and Jewish Gnosticism from Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom G. Scholem. Such voices, mystica, are particularly prominent in the unedited texts. Already the oldest documents of all the lesser Hekaloth are full of them, nor is this surprising, for shadowy elements of this kind, so far from being latter additions or signs of spiritual decadence, a prejudice dear to the modern mind, being belonging to the very core of their particular religious system. This fact has been placed beyond doubt by modern research into the history of the Hellenistic syncretism, where you find in the Greek and Coptic magical papyri written in Egypt under the Roman Empire the closest and most indissoluble union of religious fervor and mystical ecstasy with magical beliefs and practices. And you'll see some of that on my Egyptian playlist. These magical interpolations have their power and natural place in the text only to the extent that magical rites were actually practiced. Every secret name seemed to provide a further piece of protective armor against the demons, up to the point where the magical energy was no longer sufficient to overcome the obstacles which blocked the way to the Merkabah. This point is really the end of the movement as a living force. From then on, it degenerates into mere literature. It is therefore not surprising that the tracts in our possession clearly reflect two different stages: an older one, in which the movement is still a living reality, and in which, therefore, the seals and secret names occupy an important place. And a second phase, in which the process of degeneration has set in, and for this very reason the study of the texts presents few difficulties. In this second stage, the magical contents cease to represent a physical reality and are gradually eliminated, and in this way the old texts are gradually replaced by a new devotional literature, at once stilted and lyrical, which employs the elements of the original Merkabah mysticism. In our case, the first stage is represented by the greater and lesser Hekaloth. The second includes numerous texts of the Midrash, of the 10 martyrs, and of the alphabet of Rabbi Akiba. Both of those writings, which were particularly popular among the Jews of the Middle Ages. The dangers of the ascent through the palaces of the Merkabah sphere are great, particularly for those who undertake the journey without necessary preparation, let alone those who are unworthy of its object. As the journey processes, the dangers become progressively greater. Angels and archons storm against the traveler in order to drive him out. A fire which proceeds from his own body threatens to devour him. In the Hebrew book of Enoch, there is an account of the description given by the patriarch to Rabbi Ishmael of his own metamorphosis into the angel Metatron, when his flesh was transformed into fiery torches. According to the greater Hekaloth, every mystic must undergo this transformation, but with the difference that, being less worthy than Enoch, he is in danger of being devoured by the fiery torches. This transition through the opening stage of the process of mystical transfiguration is an ineluctable necessity. According to another fragment, the mystic must be able to stand upright without hands and feet, both having been burned. This standing without feet in bottomless space is mentioned elsewhere as a characteristic experience of many ecstatics. A mystic stage, closely approximating to it, is referred to in the Apocalypse of Abraham. But the most remarkable passage of all is the interpretation given already in Lesser Hekaloth of a famous fragment which is found in the Talmud and the Tosefta. This little story is included in the few pages of the treatise Haggadah, which the Talmud devotes to the subject of contemporary mysticism. 4 entered paradise. Ben Azay ben Zomah, Aher, and Rabbi Akiba. Rabbi Akiba spoke to them. When you come to the place of the shining marble plates, then do not say, water, water, for it is written, he that telleth lies shall not tarry in my sight. But when was this portion of the Talmud written? I thought it was written like the 800s or something like that. Maybe it was the 700s. In Islam, they believe at the end times that one of the signs is that there'll be a being or a force or something that, if you want to put it in different terms, that can show people water in the place of fire and fire in the place of water. So, modern interpretations of this famous passage, which clearly enough refers to a real danger in the process of ascending to paradise, are extremely far-fetched and not a little irrational in their determination at all costs to preserve the characteristic essentials of rationalism. We are told that the passages refers to cosmological speculations about the materia prima, an explanation which lacks all plausibility and finds no support in the context or in the subject matter itself. The fact is that the latter Merkabah mystics showed a perfectly corrected understanding of the meaning of this passage, and their interpretation offers striking proof that the tradition of the Tanaitic mysticism and theosophy was really alive among them, although certain details may have originated in a latter period. The following quotation is taken from the Munich manuscript of the Hekloth text. But if one was unworthy to see the king in his beauty, the angels at the gates disturbed his senses and confused him. And when they said to him, come in, he entered, and instantly they pressed him and threw him into the fiery lava stream. And at the gate of the sixth palace, it seemed as though hundreds of thousands and millions of waves of water stormed against him, and yet there was not a drop of water, only the ethereal glitter of the marble plates with which the palace was tessellated, but was standing in front of the angels. And when he asked, what is the meaning of these waters? They began to stone him and said, wretch, do you not see it with your own eyes? Are you perhaps a descendant of those who kissed the golden calf? And are you unworthy to see the king in his beauty? And he does not go until they strike his head with iron bars and wound him. And this shall be a sign for all times, that no one shall err at the gate of the sixth palace and see the ethereal glitter of the plates, and ask about them, and take them for water, that he may not endanger himself. Thus, the text, the authenticity of the story's core, the ecstatic's vision of water hardly requires proof. Nothing could be more far-fetched than to treat it as a post-festum interpretation of the Talmudic passage. There is no reason whatsoever to doubt that the mystical experience of the dangers of the ascent is really the subject of the anecdote. Similar dangers are described in the so-called liturgy of Mithras, contained in the Great Magical Papyrus of Paris, where the description of the mystical ascent shows many parallels of detail and atmosphere with the account given in the Greater Hekloth. And if it's not clear already, one of the things about the Talmudic process is sort of this because of this and that sort of stuff, sort of deductive reasoning mainly. There's other sorts of elaboration. But when it comes to religion, can't we just turn to what we know best of the revelation and the inspiration that came through the prophets? Bounce that off our own experience and interpretation thereof. Authentically interpreting it as it seems best to one to interpret, not according to your own whims and desires. It's like, oh, well, I'm not going to interpret that way because I personally don't like, because often what's best is not, because if what the scriptures say is like, well, that's difficult, it'd be easier to do this, that's sort of the sign right there of, well, it depends on how authentically transmitted the scriptures are and all that stuff. But anyways, certain things are more necessary to maintain the tradition than in other paths. Particularly vivid descriptions are given in the greater Hakaloth of the last stages of the descent, the passage through the 6th and 7th gates. These descriptions, however, are not uniform, but appear rather to be a compilation of various documents and traditions concerning the relevant experiences of the Merkabah mystic, the discussions between the traveler and the gatekeeper of the 6th palace, the archons, Damiel, and Catspiel, which take up a good deal of space, clearly date back to very early times. One of their more unexpected features is the recurrence of rudiments of certain Greek formulae and standing expressions, which editors in Babylonia were not longer capable of understanding and apparently regarded as magical names of the divinity. The fact that the original Merkabah mystics in Palestine prescribed the use of specific Greek formula for certain occasions drives special attention. It is difficult to say whether it indicates a concrete influence of Hellenistic religion or whether the employment of Greek words by the Aramaic-speaking Jewish mystics, because at the time it wasn't Hebrew, they didn't write their scriptures or anything else in Hebrew, but something that they called Aramea. Tanakh, all the text of Tanakh, all 24 books, and the side books, all were written in a language called Aramea, and we call that language Aramaic. Jewish mystics, it is merely analogous to the predilection for Hebraic or Pseudo-Hebraic formula, characteristic of Greek-speaking circles for whom the Egyptian magical papyri were written. The idea of the 7 heavens through which the soul ascends to its original home, either after death or in a state of ecstasy while the body is still alive, is certainly very old, and we see that in, the Indo-Aryan culture. In an obscure and somewhat distorted form, it is already to be found in old apocrypha, such as the 4th book of Ezra, or the Ascension of Isaiah, which is based on a Jewish text. In the same way, the ancient Talmudic account of the 7 heavens, their names, and their contents, although apparently purely cosmological, surely presupposes an ascent of the soul to the throne in the 7th heaven. Such descriptions of the 7 heavens, plus a list of the names of their archons, have come down to us from the school of the Merkabah mystics in the post-Mishnaic period. This is precisely here that we still find an entirely esoteric doctrine. Thus, for example, in the visions of Ezekiel, which have recently become known, Ezekiel sees the 7 heavens with their 7 Merkabahs reflected in the waters of the Chbar River. This form of speculation about 7 Merkabahs corresponding to the 7 heavens is still innocent of any mention of Hakaloth, or chambers of the Merkabah. Possibly both conceptions were known to different groups or schools of the same period. In any event, the second variant gradually became the dominant one. 4. This idea of the 7 Hakaloth transforms the old cosmological conception of the world structure revealed during the ascent into a description of the divine hierarchy. The traveler in search of God, like the visitor at court, must pass through endless magnificent halls and chambers. This change of emphasis, like other important aspects of the mystical system to which it belongs, appears to me to be connected with the fundamental religious experience of these mystics, namely the decisive importance which they assign to an interpretation of God as king. We are dealing here with the Judaized form of cosmocratorial mysticism concerning the divine king or emperor. And this form of adoration takes first place, and cosmological mysticism is regulated to the writings concerned with the creation of the world and commentaries to Masah Bereshith. Not without good reason has Gratz called the religious belief of the Merkabah mystic Basiliomorphism. And just like we have seen with Dr. John Dee and the Latin text, they didn't quite give the chapters and the verses quite the same. This was this chapter, part B, A, D, that sort of thing. And the Jews had full-on names, so this is a portion of Genesis. Messiah was a portion of, and, well, I mean, it's a specific portion, but yeah. Because Bereshith is a way of saying the first bit in Genesis. This point needs to be stressed, for it makes clear the enormous gulf between the Gnosticism of the Hekaloth and that of the Hellenistic mystics. There are many parallels between the two, but there is a radical difference in the conception of God. In the Hekaloth, God is above all king, to be precise, holy king. This conception reflects a change in the religious consciousness of the Jews, not only the mystics, for which the documentary evidence exists in the literature of the period. The aspects of God which are really relevant to the religious feeling of the epoch are his majesty and the aura of sublimity and solemnity which surrounds him. On the other hand, there is a complete absence of any sentiment of divine immanence. J. Abelson has made a valuable contribution to the understanding of the subject in his Immanence of God in Rabbinical Literature, where he has devoted a particularly searching analysis to the theory of the Shekinah. God's immanence are indwelling in the world. In the literature of the Aggadah, quite rightly, he has stressed the connection between these ideas and certain mystical conceptions which have played a part in the latter development of Jewish mysticism. But in the Merkabah mysticism with which we are dealing here, the idea of the Shekinah and of God's immanence plays practically no part at all. The one passage in the Greater Hekaloth which has been adduced as proof of the existence of such conceptions is based on an obviously corrupt text. The fact is that the true and spontaneous feeling of the Merkabah mystic knows nothing of divine immanence. The infinite gulf between the soul and God, the king on his throne, is not even bridged at the climax of the mystical ecstasy. Not only is there for the mystic no divine immanence, there's also almost no love of God. What there is of love in the relationship between the Jewish mystic and his God belonged to a much later period and has nothing to do with our present subject. Ecstasy there was, and this fundamental experience must have been a source of religious inspiration. But we find no trace of mystical union between the soul and God. Throughout, there remains an almost exaggerated consciousness of God's otherness, nor does the identity and individuality of the mystic become blurred even at the height of ecstatic passion. The creator and his creature remain apart, and nowhere is an attempt made to bridge the gulf between them or to blur the distinction. The mystic, who in his ecstasy has passed through all the gates, braved all the dangers, now stands before the throne. He sees and hears, but that is all. All the emphasis is laid on the kingly aspect of God, not his creative one, although the two belong together, and the second, as we shall see, even becomes, in a certain perspective of this mysticism, the dominant one. True, the mysteries of creation and the hidden connection between all things existing in the universe are among the riddles whose solution is of deep interest to the authors of the Hekaloth tracts. There are some references to them in the description of the Merkabah vision. Thus, the Greater Hekaloth give promises of the revelation of the mysteries and wonderful secrets of the tissue on which the perfection of the world and its course depends, and the chain of heaven and earth along which all the wings of the universe and the wings of the heavenly heights are connected, sewn together, made fast, and hung up. But the promise is not carried out, the secret not revealed. The magnificence and majesty of God, on the other hand, this experience of the Yorda Merkabah, which overwhelms and overshadows all the others, is not only heralded, but also described with an abundance of detail, and almost to excess. Strange and sometimes obscure the names given to God, the King who thrones in his glory. We find names such as Zoharariel, Adir Iran, Actariel, and Totrasia, or Tetrasia, i.e. the tetras are fourfoldness of the letters of God's name, Yahweh, names which to the mystics may have signified various aspects of God's glory. In this context, it is well to remember that the chief peculiarity of this form of mysticism, its emphasis on God's might and magnificence, opens the door to the transformation of mysticism into theurgy. There, the master of the secret names himself takes on the exercise of power in the way described in the various magical and theurgical procedures of which this literature is full. The language of the theurgist conforms to that of the Merkabah mystic. Both are dominated by the attributes of power and sublimity, not love or tenderness. It is entirely characteristic of the outlook of these believers that the theurgist, in adjuring the Prince of Divine Presence, summons the archons as princes of majesty, fear and trembling. Majesty, fear, and trembling are indeed the key words to this open sesame of religion. 5. This is a particularly interesting one. The most important sources for our understanding of this atmosphere are undoubtedly the numerous prayers and hymns which have been preserved in the Hekaloth tracts. Now, that's not just trance-inducing or setting up an imaginary realm or something like that. It's promoting a piety and a relationship with the practice. Because a lot of people, it's just either trying to figure out how to get high with the drugs and, not hurt yourself too bad, or get high without drugs and, not go too crazy, But, there's more to it. Tradition ascribes them to inspiration, for, according to the mystics, they are nothing but the hymns sung by the angels, even by the throne itself, in praise of God. In chapter 4 of the Greater Hekaloth, in which these hymns occupy an important place, we find an account of how Rabbi Akiba, the prototype of the Merkabah visionary, was inspired to hear them sung at the very throne of glory before which his soul was standing. Conversely, their recitation serves to induce a state of ecstasy and accompanies the traveler on his journey through the gates. Some of these hymns are simply adjurations of God, others take the form of dialogues between God and the heavenly dwellers, and descriptions of the Merkabah sphere. It would be vain to look for definite religious doctrines, to say nothing of mystical symbols, in these hymns, which belong to the oldest products of synagogal poetry, the so-called piyut. Often, they are curiously bare of meaning, and yet the impression they create is a profound one. And, some stuff isn't too dense, but if you're using a Semitic language, everything has meaning. Particularly if people are literate in Hebrew, they may not get that, but versus looking into the Aramea. But, yeah. Even though Hebrew, if you speak any Hebrew, you probably speak it in a living sense. So, Rudolf Otto, in his celebrated book, The Idea of the Holy, has stressed the difference between a purely rational glorification of God, in which everything is clear, definite, familiar, comprehensible, and one which touches the springs of the irrational, or the numinous, as he calls it, one which tries to reproduce in words the mysterium tremendum, the awful mystery that surrounds God's majesty. Otto has called compositions of this latter sort numinous hymns. The Jewish liturgy, and not only that of the mystics, contains a great number of these, and from the Jewish liturgy, Otto himself has drawn some of the most important of his examples. In the Hekaloth books, we have, as it were, a full treasure house of such numinous hymns. The immense solemnity of their style, the bombast of their magnificent phrases, reflects the fundamental paradoxy of these hymns, the climax of sublimity and solemnity, to which the mystic can attain in his attempt to express the magnificence of his vision, is also the non plus ultra of vacuousness. Philip Bloch, who was the first to be deeply impressed by the problem presented by these hymns, speaks of their plethora of purely pleonastic and unisonous words, which do not in the least assist the process of thought, but merely reflect the emotional struggle. But at the same time, he shows himself aware of the almost magical effect of this vacuous and yet sublime pathos on those who are praying when, for example, hymns are composed in this spirit, are recited on the Day of Atonement. Perhaps the most famous example of this kind is the Litany Hadareth, the Ha'emuna, Lahei Olamim, which is to be found with a wealth of variations in the greater Hekaloth, and has been included in the liturgy of the high holidays. The medieval commentators referred to it as the Song of the Angels, and it is probably that it's called for the deepest devotion and solemnity on the part of those who prayed. But a formal demand of this kind can hardly have been necessary, for the mighty effect of these incomparably solemn and at the same time infinitely vacuous hymns, i.e. their numinous character, can be witnessed to this day in every synagogue. No wonder that to this day this hymn is recited by many Hasidic Jews every Sabbath among the morning prayers. The following is an approximate translation of the text, which is entirely a medley of praises of God and citations of the attributes that appertain to him who lives eternally. Excellence and faithfulness are his who lives forever. Understanding and blessing are his who lives forever. Grandeur and greatness are his who lives forever. Cognition and expression are his who lives forever. Magnificence and majesty are his who lives forever. Counsel and strength are his who lives forever. Luster and brilliance are his who lives forever. Grace and benevolence are his who lives forever. Purity and goodness are his who lives forever. Unity and honor are his who lives forever. Crown and glory are his who lives forever. Precept and practice are his who lives forever. Sovereignty and rule are his who lives forever. Adornment and permanence are his who lives forever. Mystery and wisdom are his who lives forever. Might and meekness are his who lives forever. Splendor and wonder are his who lives forever. Righteousness and honor are his who lives forever. Invocation and holiness are his who lives forever. Exaltation and nobility are his who lives forever. Song and hymn are his who lives forever. Praise and glory are his who lives forever. Invocation and holiness are his who lives forever. Now, just because it says his doesn't mean we're calling God a male here. Let's not fall into thinking that's what it's saying. This is, in its original language, a classical example of alphabetical litany, which fills the imagination of the devotee with splendid concepts clothed in magnificent expression. The particular words do not matter. To quote Bloch again, the glorification of God is not that of the psalm, which either describes the marvels of creation as proof of the grandeur and the glory of the Creator, or stresses the element of divine grace and guidance in the history of Israel as throwing light on the wisdom and benevolence of providence. It is simply praising of God, and this praise is heaped and multiplied as if there were a danger that some honorific might be forgotten. Another passage from a hymn to Zuhar Ariel, Adonai, God of Israel, in the Greater Hekaloth runs as follows. His throne radiates before him, and his palace is full of splendor. His majesty is becoming, and his glory is an adornment for him. His servants sing before him, and proclaim the might of his wonders. As King of all kings and Master of all masters, encircled by rows of crowns, surrounded by the ranks of the princes of splendor, with a gleam of his ray he encompasses the sky, and his splendor radiates from the heights. Abysses flame from his mouth, and firmaments sparkle from his body. Almost all the hymns from the Hekaloth tracts, particularly those whose text has been preserved intact, reveal a mechanism comparable to the motion of an enormous flywheel in cyclical rhythm. The hymns succeed each other, and within them the adjurations of God follow in a crescendo of glittering and majestic attributes, each stressing and reinforcing the sonorous power of the world. The monotony of the rhythm almost all consist of verses of 4 words, and the progressively sonorous incantations induce in those who are praying a state of mind bordering on ecstasy. An important part of this technique is the recurrence of the key word of the numinous, the Kedusha, Trishagion from Isaiah 6:3, in which the ecstasy of the mystic culminates. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. One can hardly conceive of a more grandiose proof of the irresistible influence which the conception of God's kingdom exercised on the consciousness of these mystics. The holiness of God, which they are trying to paraphrase, is utterly transcendent of any moral meaning and represents nothing but glory of his kingdom. Through various forms of the prayer known as the Kedusha, this conception has also found its way into the general Jewish liturgy and left its imprint on it. In spite of the last mentioned fact, it cannot be denied that this polylogy, or verbiage of the mystics, these magniloquent attempts to catch a glimpse of God's majesty and to preserve it in hymnical form, stands in sharp contrast to the tendencies which already, during the Talmudical period, dominated the outlook of the great teachers of the law. They could not but feel repelled by it, and in the Talmud one early encounters a strong dislike for extravagant enthusiasm in prayer, much as the Sermon on the Mount had attacked the polylogy of the non-Christian polytheists, you could say. They're effusive. I mean, there weren't Christians at that time, so the polytheists, I guess. Their effusive and wordy style. Passages like the following read like an attack on the tendencies reflected in the Hekaloth tracts. He who multiplies the praise of God to excess shall be torn from the world. Or, in the presence of Rabbi Hanina, one went to the praying desk to say the prayer. He said, God, thou great, strong, terrible, mighty, feared, powerful, real, and adorable. He waited until the other had finished, and then he said to him, have you ended with praise of your God? What is the meaning of all this? It is as if one were to praise the king of the world, who has millions of pieces of gold. I may cut that sentence out. Is if one were to praise the king of the world, who has millions of pieces of gold for the possession of a piece of silver. But this resistance to an enthusiasm and a verbiage so different from the classical simplicity and rationality of the fundamental prayers of Jewish liturgy was of no avail. That much is clear, not only from the prayers and hymns of the Merkabah mystics, but also from certain important parts of the liturgy proper, whose spirit reflects the influence of the Yorda Merkabah.